Okay, and now I will introduce, today we actually have a double billing. We have two speakers and we will start with Nimanthi Perera-Rajasingham, who is an associate professor of English and Women's Studies at Colgate University. She teaches Marxism, postcolonial studies, critical race and ethnic studies, and feminism. Her book, Assembling Ethnicities in Neoliberal Times, Ethnographic Fictions and Sri Lanka's War, was published by Northwestern University Press. Working on another book now on global apartheid and war on terror, which looks at the ongoing and recalibrated forms of segregation that the war on terror has enabled. Following Nimanthi, we will have a presentation by Ani Maitra, who is Associate Professor of Film and Media Studies, also at Colgate University. His teaching and research interests span the field of postcolonial and diaspora media cultures, gender and sexuality studies. He has numerous essays in edited volumes, such as Camera and journals like Camera Obscura, Continuum, Differences, Film Quarterly. Maitra is the author of Identity Mediation and the Cunning of Capital, which was published by Northwestern University Press last year. So without further ado, I will hand over the microphone to Nimanthi.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen as I speak. I first want to thank Iftikhar Dadi, Daniel Bass, Gloria Limu Chavez, and also I know Gitika Singha, who's there, for kind of being involved in bringing us over. I'm really grateful. So I'm going to turn to my first image, right? The image you're seeing on the left-hand corner is the cover of my book, and I write about it in the conclusion of my book. It was drawn by Jaffna-based artist Dharmodaran Pillai Shanathanan during the final phase of Sri Lanka's ethno-nationalist war. For those who don't know much about it, the war lasted between 1983 and ended in 2009, and was fought between a state dominated by the Sinhalese ethnic group and the separatist group, the Tamil Tigers, or the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE. If this image places land in the war zones of the north and east of the country as being under surveillance and emptied of vitality, after 2009, when the war ended with the defeat of the militants, this land was transformed into kind of these pleasure domes, right, by the global tourist industry. These beaches, the beaches in the north and east quickly became dotted with luxury resorts to cater to both the local elite and international tourists, with little regard for the desires and needs of the local fishing populations who lived on these beaches. The state used these resorts and other forms of kind of neoliberal projects, like setting up of export processing zones and factories for export in the north and east, to boast about the peace that had been achieved through increased development into these regions. Such rapid transformations over the past decade after the war ended has led a number of scholars capitalism only entered the north and east at the end of the war, right? So I have here, for example, Kanchana Ruanpura and Annalise Gojer, who say that and I'm just going to read the quote, we use the conceptual lens of primitive accumulation to theoretically frame and appraise its applicability in a post-war setting, where vast populations of the north and east, particularly those who were under de facto LTT control, had been effectively divorced from socioeconomic changes in the rest of the country over the past 3 decades, right? Similar claims are made, for example, by Ahirlan Kadregama, who in an article written for the EPW called Second Wave of Neoliberalism, describes the North and East, I quote, as cut off from markets for decades until the end of the war. This trend of seeing neoliberalism as entering war zones only after the conclusion of the war demonstrates a general tendency within Sri Lankan scholarship to study ethnonationalism and the war as separate and delinked from neoliberalism and free markets. In the south of Sri Lanka, where kind of a neoliberal model of development has dominated since 1977, the general argument that's made is that war has impeded the penetration of neoliberalism, right? Now, contrary to that, my work in Assembling Ethnicities in Neoliberal Times argues that Sri Lanka's 30-year-long war and its accompanying ethno-nationalism were deeply structured and reanimated by the forces of global capitalism. While ethnic tensions in Sri Lanka are rooted in longer histories of colonialism and nationalism, the implementation of neoliberalism from 1977 onwards has exacerbated, reignited, and channeled the pathways of nationalism and violence, even as warfare and racism has mutated and transformed neoliberalism as it interacted and encountered the ground realities of ethnic hostilities. In the context of the north and east of Sri Lanka, neoliberalism encountered the authoritarian politics of the militant Tamil tigers and was transformed into a neoliberalism in the shadows. As such, using the work of Aiwa Ong, I suggest that we think along with her of neoliberalism as an assemblage. And this is kind of, I'm using her language, a mobile technology that is implemented according to specific contexts as an unstable constellation shaped by interacting global forms and situated political regimes. To insist that global capitalism is essential to the shape of nationalism and racism is not really a surprising claim if we consider the rich scholarship on racial capitalism, for example, by scholars, African-American scholars and scholars in Africa, right? African scholars. So to think through the claims that spaces such as conflict zones are deeply penetrated by neoliberalism, I'm indebted to the work of Caroline Nordstrom, who in her path-breaking study, Shadows of War, Violence, Power, and International Profiteering in the 21st Century, discusses a range of extra-state and extra-legal activities that proliferate across centers of power in the shadows of war. She uses the term shadows to signal, and I'm quoting here, cross-state economic and political linkages that move outside formally recognized state-based channels, networks that broker power comparable to, and in some cases greater than the power of some of the world's states. And to define networks that are confined solely to that aren't confined solely to criminal, illicit, or illegal activities, but across various divides between legal, quasi-legal, and downright illegal activities. Now, to kind of bear this out for the rest of my time, I will focus on the work of Dalit writer and actor Shobha Shakti, right? To illustrate how the film he acts in and the work he writes tell us about neoliberalism in the shadows. The novel of his that I turned to, Guerrilla, written in 2008, I believe, right, documents his childhood as a Tamil militant and his escape from militancy to Paris. And in the final part of my presentation, I turn to the 2015 film Dheepan, directed by Jacques Autriat, to connect the shadow practices in the north of Sri Lanka to the suburban immigrant populations, immigrants housed in public housing projects in Paris. Here I extend Nordstrom's argument about how shadow economies in conflict zones. Here I extend Nordstrom's argument about shadow economies in conflict zones to ask if urban immigrant ghettos, structures by racist forms of disarticulation from mainstream Paris, can be considered conflict zones, right? So let me turn to Guerrilla. Dalit writer Shobha Shakti, who now lives in Paris, calls his 2008 novel Gorilla autofiction to define its mix of fiction, fact, and biographical detail, right? And in my book, I called this ethnographic fiction. And by that, the term I use is that these are texts that take very seriously the task of documenting the external world. And if you think of him as a minority writer, kind of wanting to document state atrocities, right? But also writing that's very self-conscious, that a simple kind of translation and positivism can't work. And so have built-in mechanisms to disrupt that seamlessness, right? So his autofiction, I think, is a kind of ethnographic fiction, right? The descriptive and documentary features, footnotes, specific dates, specific places, real incidents, and short biographies of the lives of his characters highlight the novel's ethnographic qualities. In addition, both the novel and the film re-narrate or re-perform a version of Shobha Shakti's past. For he, like his fictional iterations, once belonged to the Tamil Tigers, escaped the movement, worked in the underworld, gained entry to France with forged papers in 1993, lived in public housing, and performed a variety of flexible forms of labor in Paris. Yet even as the novel references the outside world objectively, the protagonist's split character, which in the novel takes the form of Rocky Raj, and then in a different section, Anthony Dasan, and also Gorilla, connects mimetic narrative to alterity and alienated subjectivity. While in the chapter, I discuss the arms trading that the novel kind of discusses, right? That the shadow economic practices at greater length. Let me refer to the title of the book and one key incident to illustrate my point about neoliberalism in the shadows. The novel's title initially refers to Rocky Raj's father, who is described as the village thug, right? The play on the terms gorilla, the title of the book, and gorilla, the militant, or father Tamil tiger, can help us refine what a shadow form of neoliberalism is. In the beginning of the novel, Rocky Raj believes that the two are opposites. Rocky Raj hates his father and his violent behavior and is mightily impressed when the guerrillas or the Tamil tigers, and I quote, thrash gorilla within an inch of his life for stealing from local fishermen. Their actions as protectors of the vulnerable motivate Rocky Raj to join the movement, right? And these quotes of the two terms are offered in the text, right? Now, while at first glance, these two terms seem disconnected, as the novel progresses, we come to understand that gorilla, the thug, the animalistic kind of thug that he thinks his father is, and gorilla, the militant, are both references to a system that functions in the shadow. For their shared features of peripatetic movement, hit and run, and stealth allude to ethnic militancy or guerrilla warfare and extra state economic and governance practices, right? So neoliberalism, as I think of it, as a form of theory, right? A moment in the novel that illuminates this is when, after joining the Tigers, Rocky Raj guards the Tiger security checkpoint in his hometown. It's in a Dalit colony, right? And comes to hear of illegal sand hauling occurring on one of the beaches. As he tells us, I quote, the people in the area had been petitioning the government for years to stop the coast from being dug up for commercial sand, and as it led to the erosion of the land and allowed the sea to enter further inland, end of quote. The novel explains further that state attempts to halt illegal sand hauling were not successful until the LTTE enforced this law strictly. Hence, when he comes to hear that someone is hauling sand, Rocky Raj jumps into action, believing he is acting as a tiger representative, protecting people and the environment. As a Dalit, This becomes a moment for Rocky Raj to exercise equality for all before the law, irrespective of caste. This moment of assertion is also when he learns about the tiger's beliefs and governing rationality. For when he and Ravi, a fellow cadre, come upon the haulers, they order them to stop. Rocky Raj is told by the driver of the truck that the hauling was done for Vijay Kumar, a supporter of the movement who, and I quote, when the others were afraid of the police and the army, was involved with us, meaning the Tamil Tigers, right? Hence, because he supports the movement, the Tigers allow Vijay Kumar to break the law. Patronage politics of this kind expands the possibilities of free market trading within the North. Indeed, we might describe the extraction of sand as a form of accumulation by dispossession, whereby markets and businessmen are allowed to carry out illegal practices as long as they support the tigers and expand tiger wealth and networks. The mutually beneficial relationship between businessmen and the tigers is expressed by one of the sand haulers. And he says, I quote, Thambi, we donate lakhs and lakhs of rupees to your movement. Are you blocking us? Right? Again, this statement combines Tamil militancy and market rationality together. The sand haulers have special privileges because they are supporters of the LTTE. A corporate and entrepreneurial rationality also transform laws and governing patterns, making that which is illegal acceptable because it can be profitable for both parties. This is a key moment of rupture in Rocky Raj's confidence in the movement's revolutionary potential. Vijay Kumar, the businessman who wanted the sand hauled, comes looking for Rocky Raj and Ravian after the incident on the beach. The novel describes Vijay Kumar as follows, and I quote, the man who was driving the motorbike was fair-skinned and well-built. He was wearing his veshti wrapped around his thighs, thug style. And later, when Vijay Kumar attempts to assault the two boys, the novel says, and again I quote, Rocky Raj had never expected the fair-skinned thug to physically attack them, end of quote. He is described as a thug, a term generally reserved for Rocky Raj's father, Gorilla. The sand hauling incident allows us to notice once more the overlaps between Gorilla and Gorilla, right? Gorilla, the thug, and Gorilla, the militants. Both are thugs whose economic practices can be described as a kind of accumulation by dispossession, a taking by force, or shadow neoliberalism, right? Now, historically, we know the Tamil Tigers, especially in the 90s and after, organized themselves so well that their profits through trade paralleled those of a multinational corporation, right? Indeed, to kind of quote Omar Karmi, through its licit and illicit businesses and fronts, the Tamil Tigers generated an estimated 200, 300 million US dollars per year, after accounting for its estimated $8 million per year costs within the LTTE administered Sri Lanka. The profit margins of their operating budget would likely be the envy of a multinational corporation, of any multinational corporation. Given this, what describes is the emergence of a shadow formation consistent with neoliberalism, right? So I'm going to turn in the final part now to Dheepan briefly. And I use the film to highlight how such shadow practices occur in Western urban segregated enclaves too, and how the film asks us to reconsider what a conflict zone and a comfort zone are, right? It kind of collapses that distinction. So I'm gonna, like, I don't have any more video. I'm gonna, can everyone see kind of the video screen that I'm sharing? It says Dheepan. Okay, good. Thank you. So Dheepan is a film that won the Cannes Palme d'Or Award, I think, in 2015, right? And it's a story of a Tamil LTT commander who flees the north of Sri Lanka once the Sri Lankan state had defeated the Tamil Tigers. Very much like Shobha Shakti, Dheepan rejects the violence of militancy which had cost him his family upon his arrival in Paris. To facilitate his passage into Paris and be eligible for asylum, Deepan pretends that he's married to a stranger, a woman that the film calls Yalini, and that he's the father of Ilan, right? So they form kind of a pretend family. When we encounter Deepan in Paris, and I'm just going to show this clip as I talk, when we encounter Deepan in Paris, he's already commodified as cheap labor, selling cheap baubles on the streets of Paris's touristic kind of enclaves that he drapes on his body, fusing his racialized body to the commodities he hopes to sell. As he is inserted into the economy to perform labor that most French citizens refuse to. The scene ends with Deepan fleeing the police as he is still awaiting his asylum case and has no permission to sell such wares. He begins life in Paris, trading in the shadows, right? So soon after this scene, the family gained legal kind of asylum and they moved to public housing in Paris. And I don't know if many of you know, but in Paris, public housing projects are like segregated and far away from the centers of the city. And these kind of really disarticulated, ghettoized, disconnected like spaces, right? So the family's disarticulation from mainstream Paris and into the shadow economies into shadow economies become clear as Deepan becomes the cleaner of the building, while Yalini cooks and cleans for an elderly relative of a gang member named Brahim, right? Now, this apartment complex functions by its members selling drugs and being part of kind of what you would call a shadow economy, right? And I want to pause, and again, I'm going to show you a clip as I talk through this, and give me a second, this is 16. This is the moment when the family arrive in this housing complex, right? And the manager takes them through, right? The complex manager gives them a tour of the place and tells Deepan what work he will have to do as an all-purpose cleaner of the complex. At this point, none of the three really speak any French, and much of the conversation is incomprehensible to them. Ilan, the child, has learned some French and tries with difficulty to understand and translate. Hence, they understand by observing the landscape and people. Much like ethnographers traveling to a strange place with limited linguistic capacities, the trio struggle with what they see and hear. We too are shown the complex from their eyes and are invited to see into the suburbs of Paris from within this alienated and subordinated perspective. Pointing to a set of buildings that are empty and abandoned, the manager explains how at one point repairs were started, but stopped as money ran out. So those half-repaired apartments are now unusable and closed. The three Tamils do not understand what he says, but they can see apartments that look bombed out, a striking visual representation of a ravaged landscape, so similar to what they had just left behind. The apartment they are given, let me just turn to that, and that's my kind of final clip, and I kind of end with that. Let me get to that. Oops. It's hard to maneuver these things. Here we go. Okay. The apartment they are given could have been found in a war-torn town in the north of Sri Lanka. It has been closed up for years and needs to be forcibly opened. The rooms have flaking wallpaper with broken parts of the apartment scattered throughout it. This is their welcome, cheap housing so they can perform cheap, disposable labor. The family must move to a new jungle, a place as marginalized and as marginalizing as the war zones. The precarious lives they have built for themselves against the devastating logic of the French state that denies them equal citizenship are short-lived. One day, the apartment complex is caught up in a series of shootings between gangs in a desperate attempt to prevent them and other civilians from being killed or injured. Dheepan, our protagonist, draws a white line across the different buildings, between the buildings occupied and manned by the gangs and the buildings where average civilians live. As he draws this line, he shouts out, "No fire zone," to the gangs, meaning that they cannot cross over, trying to separate conflict and comfort zones, right? The white line that is meant to separate civilians from the gangs prove unsustainable. As Yalini is caught, his wife is, and they become kind of intimate, right? They start out as a fake family and they become intimate. So he cares for her by this point. As Yalini is caught in the crossfire between gang members, to rescue her, Dheepan espouses of violence that he had rejected, the violence of militancy, right? Suburban Paris is suited at this moment to the war zones in Sri Lanka, and both forms of violence are shaped and undergirded by the shadow economic forms that are also part of neoliberalism. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nimanthi. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nimanthi, for that. I also would like to thank Iftikhar for that kind introduction and for inviting me to the South Asia Program lecture series. Thank you also to Daniel and Gloria for all the work behind the scenes. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as well so that you can see my slides. Let's see. Okay, so the talk today, Queer Aesthetic Dissonance in Karishma Dubey's Devi, comes out of the final chapter of my book that Iftikhar mentioned, Identity, Mediation, and the Cunning of Capital. Broadly speaking, the book argues for the need to examine identity politics, by which I mean collective struggles around interrelated categories of difference like race, class, gender, and sexuality, as a multiply mediated economic and aesthetic operation that is regulated by the shifting demands of global capitalism. So if we typically understand minority identity as something that needs to be reclaimed, asserted, or protected, I argue that the global dominance of capitalism also needs to be understood through the endurance of identity as an overdetermined media effect or mediation. To track the persistence of identity politics from the era of decolonization to the present, the book analyzes a range of aesthetic texts, heterogeneous in their global origins and their media. I move from anti-colonial polemics to 20th century Asian American literature, to post-colonial Algerian feminist cinema, to LGBTQIA+ media, from contemporary India, to examine the mediated production of identity as a site of inequality, oppression, and fragmentation. Crucially, when I say that identities are effects of mediation, I do not mean to say that identity production is governed by the properties or effects of any particular mass media technology. Rather, I read identity as a subjective and social fragmentation between several media forms under colonial and post-colonial systems of governance. In my argument, the mediation of identity under capitalism at once includes and exceeds the effects of singular media technologies like print capitalism, radio, cinema, and the digital. In today's talk, I'm going to examine how Karishma Dubey's 2017 short film, Devi, articulates this fragmented mediation of identity in the context of queer politics in India. I'm going to suggest that what makes Devi stand out is its queer aesthetic dissonance, or what I'm calling queer aesthetic dissonance, with the dominant rhetoric of LGBTQ plus politics in contemporary India, and more broadly on the global stage. Interestingly, Devi premiered at the Kashish Mumbai International Queer Film Festival in 2017. This is from the 2021 Call for Films. The festival is in its 12th edition. In my book, I examined both the history and strategically identitarian rhetoric of this festival in some detail. While I won't have time to go into that analysis today, I'd like to note a couple of things that will be useful in the context of my reading of Dubé's film. First, what stands out in Kashish's self-representation is the desire to echo the universalist and now heavily corporatized rhetoric of LGBTQ plus IA rights. That is to say, in its official rhetoric, the Kashish Film Festival is eager to emphasize a certain globally oriented queer Indianness, as well as its own intermediary role as an ambassador for an LGBTQ plus India that is poised to join other liberal progressive nation states of the world. This sentiment is exemplified by this image from the 2015 Kashish trailer, in which a heart-shaped Indian flag appears as part of a much larger arboreal global queer alliance of nation states as hearts. Second, even as it appears eager to join a global queer alliance, the Kashish Film Festival is careful to make itself legible to a regional Indian and South Asian audience. More specifically, it is careful to maintain a rhetoric that includes local and indigenous queer identities that are not otherwise visible in the transnational abbreviation of LGBTQ plus or LGBTQIA plus. So for instance, this trailer image from the 2017 edition of Kashish presents a panoply of identities that includes not just lesbian, gay, and intersex, but also Koti and Hijra, which are non-heteronormative identities specific to India and more broadly, South Asia. Thus, we might say that the global and the local together constitute Kashish's 2017 theme of Diverse One, celebrating queer unity across identitarian differences. Yet, it is precisely this narrative of self-consolidation and seemingly egalitarian alliances that is questioned by the aesthetics and politics of the film Devi. Screened at the 2017 edition of Kashish, which I attended, the film prompts viewers to approach queer identity and identification as that which is necessarily split between a cinematic mode of production and a highly exploitative post-colonial regime of labor. And when I say cinematic mode of production, I'm referring to Jonathan Beller's phrase, where he's basically thinking of cinema as visuality, not just film, but visuality more broadly as the site of value production, or as a site of value production that is integral to capitalism. The aesthetics of the film, I argue, reveals the limits of post-colonial identitarianism, as well as the aesthetic anti-essentialism popular in certain quarters of the Anglo-American Academy. I'm not going to go too much into the aesthetic anti-essentialism that I'm referring to, but we can come back to it during the Q&A if it raises questions. The narrative of Devi revolves around the eponymous protagonist, a live-in domestic worker for an affluent family in New Delhi. An erotic attraction develops between Devi and her employer's teenage daughter, Tara, but the two women are able to enjoy only a brief period of clandestine intimacy until Tara's mother fires Devi shortly after a dinner guest outs them as lovers. The political significance of this narrative, however, is inseparable from the film's aesthetic choices that gesture toward the exclusions produced by the economic and cultural mediations of queer, and more specifically, lesbian visibility in contemporary India. There are several moments in Devi where cinematic form or aesthetics encourages the spectator to see female same-sex desire as the site of social transgression within the heteronormative household. Gendered and classed domestic spaces, such as the kitchen and the servant's bedroom on the terrace, are cinematically reinvented as queer spaces where the two women express their desire for each other. and I'll play a short clip. I just want to make sure that I selected the sounds. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Yep, I did. Okay. And I'd request you all to raise your volumes as much as possible, as the volume on my end is quite low. So thank you for that. So here's the first clip from Devi.
सच सच बताओ क्या हो गया?
क्या फर्क पड़ता है?
मत बताओ।
उन्हें इसी से प्रॉब्लम है और कुछ नहीं।
माँ सही में घबरा गई थी। टाइप क्या हो गया है?
Again, my apologies for the low volume. Hopefully the subtitles helped. This early scene in the film suggests an ambiguous erotic spark between Devi and Thara, where they share a smoke on the balcony in front of the servant's room. The scene opens with a very brief shot where Thara lights a cigarette in Devi's mouth, turning the phallic object into the symbol of cross-class female intimacy and reciprocity. The scene does include a brief conversation. Devi wants to know more about an altercation with which the film opens, where Thara angrily retaliates against a stranger's misogynist and homophobic remark on the street. But the camera in this scene is more interested in focusing on the space of desire suggested through the proximity of the women's bodies, the tone of their voices, and the shared cigarette. Tightly framed close-ups in a shot reverse shot structure in dim lighting carve out the space from within which a concerned Devi reaches out to touch the bruise in Thara's forehead, and Thara longingly looks at Devi as she takes a puff and coughs gently. The space of desire is reiterated in the course of the film as the ambiguous intimacy becomes more explicitly erotic. In another brief scene where Thara comes to sleep in Devi's room at night, the women's bodies come even closer in another tightly framed close-up, their mouths almost but not quite touching. And later scenes set in the kitchen, the normative morality of the dinner party outside is once again suspended temporarily when the camera frame includes nothing other than the display of their same-sex desire. In these moments, Devi uses cinematic conventions to encourage the spectator to actively cultivate a kind of looking that isolates erotic desire from the structural and material inequalities within which desire takes shape. In a sense, even as they make us conscious of our technologized gaze through the camera, these moments could also be seen as a homoerotic version of what Kevin Floyd has called the reification of desire under capitalism. This is a reification that capitalism enables by creating a temporality that sets sexual desire apart from social life, that represented as ostensibly independent of other social temporalities. Arguably, the spectator, and especially the kashish spectator, is expected to desire this reification to a certain extent, waiting for the moment of disruption or of the heteronormative diegetic world of the film. If, as Jonathan Beller argues, to look is to labor within the cinematic mode of production, in these moments of heightened focus of same-sex desire in Devi, to want to look is to labor with the camera, the performers, and the crew, to imagine female same-sex desire as transgressive of dominant norms and systems of exclusion. This is where cinematic form seems to wish to convey what Carl Schoonover and Rosalind Galt have called queer worlding, an anti-essentialist space for non-heteronormative desire created by cinema. This is, however, not the only kind of mediated or cinematic looking that Devi enables. Alongside and in contrast with the formal construction of the heterotopic space of desire, the film also keeps in our view the informal and yet indispensable aspect of Devi's labor and her precarious status as a living domestic servant. That is to say, the film's subversion of its queer formalism unfolds through its own insistence on the protagonist's exceptional socioeconomic marginality, a position of servitude that lies within, but also extends well beyond the queer world that the film constructs. Globalization theorist Aiwa Ang has argued that neoliberalism, as the dominant technique of governmentality deployed both in advanced and developing economies, operates not by imposing a homogeneous labor regime, but rather through a heterogeneous mix of regulatory and incarceral labor, creating highly, quote, striated spaces of production that combine different kinds of labor regimes. And I think this intersects directly with what Nimanthi was bringing up. Neoliberalism, in Ang's view, is a combination of technologized forms of self-management and so-called low-skilled labor, often deprived of juridical political protections. Davy draws our attention to this heterogeneous space of production, not only through its narrative, but also its aesthetic focus on the classed, gendered, and disciplinary dimension of domestic labor in the urban Indian household. Consequently, the film compels the spectator to confront the coevalness as well as a certain discontinuity between the spectatorial labor of eroticized looking, elicited by the cinematic isolation of homoerotic space, and the labor that Davy performs on screen for the well-being of her employer. So I'm interested in the film's kind of evocation of these two different spaces and kinds of labor. A scene in the kitchen between Davy and Tara's mother, immediately following the balcony scene, establishes the paradoxical nature of the protagonist's labors of servitude. The scene extends the cross-class conviviality between Tara and Davy. The mistress of the house shares her worries about her rebellious teenage daughter with the maid while the latter does the dishes. At the same time, it's also clear that what makes the scene convivial is the affective labor that Davy performs as the ever-attentive domestic. She not only performs her chores, but also offers her mistress a sympathetic ear. As the mistress raises a tall glass of water to her forehead to soothe her headache, Davy spontaneously responds to her discomfort by putting a few ice cubes into the glass, bringing a smile on the mistress's face. A medium shot of Davy's hands reaching out for the glass brings into view the affective dimension of this physical labor that the domestic routinely performs for the household. The scene foregrounds how Davy's rapport with her mistress is contingent on the emotional and physical work that she must perform to be the exceptional servant, always near at hand and responsive to the needs of Tara and her mother. Simultaneously, the film deploys several aesthetic markers to establish Davy's lower class status, the undervalued nature of her domestic labor, and ultimately the substitutability of her labor power. These markers, when read from within the post-colonial Indian context, connote persistent structural inequalities that inform communicational norms and bodily comportment within the domestic sphere. The film insists on the everyday materiality of the domestic's exclusion from the sphere when the camera captures Davy in a medium shot in the kitchen, drinking from a metallic cup, as she listens patiently to her mistress's complaints. The visual contrast between the mistress's glass and the servant's cup highlights the normalization of discriminatory treatment and disciplinary power in the apparently inclusive household. As cinematic signifiers, the cup and the glass, in relation to the social positions of the bodies that drink from them, introduce class antagonism that has been naturalized. The signifiers function as the so-called commonsensical representation of social difference between the employer and the servant that is fictional, and yet immediately legible in the Indian context, and unmistakable markers of class boundaries within the household. The film's most powerful signifier of servitude emerges in his later scene, where Davy, after serving tea to her mistress and her daughter, walks to the dimly lit foreground in the far right toward a bucket and a mop. And I'm going to play this clip as well. It's very brief.
To get you on the phone. Yes, 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 lots of lovely ladies waiting for you. Okay. Tara, you need to oil your hair.
So we can talk about the background and the foreground. There's a lot going on in terms of the mise en scène, but I want to point out here is, even as nothing of consequence happens in the frame, the camera lingers until Devi turns into silhouette, bends down and wrings the water out of the mop into the bucket. Here, the hierarchy between the upper class employer and the lower class employee is figured not only through their positions in postures of the actors, but through the sound associated with Devi's routine household chore. It's significant that audiovisually, Devi almost disappears into her labor, in the sense that her presence can only be felt through the sound of her labor, the sound of wringing water that becomes an index of her primary function and identity in the household, and the sound accentuated by the percussion there. This acoustic index remains in the final shot of the film. That is a variation on the living room scene, and this will be one more clip that I'll play. It's also the last scene.
And some tea. Okay.
As Tara joins her mother for breakfast the morning after the party, the domestic brings in tea before returning to her chore of cleaning the steps. However, the division of labor, marking the similarity or continuity between the two scenes, is also predicated on interchangeability. As the spectator realizes with Tara in this moment, a new servant has replaced Devi. The familiar sound with which the film ends, of the mop that the new servant rings on the steps, finally becomes an aesthetic trace of Devi's identity as replaceable and informal labor power. In this way, the film Devi unsettles its own visual mediation of lesbian desire by drawing our attention to the mediation through which the post-colonial household, and by extension, the nation, reconciles class conflict through distinct forms of labor and erotic regulation. The closing of the film further underscores the striated regime of labor ultimately responsible for Devi's expulsion, through the mistress's disparate responses to the lovers after the departure of the dinner guests. "We're gay now, aren't we?" the disgruntled mother asks Tara in English, in a tone that mixes heterosexist intolerance with liberal recognition. For Tara, this brief moment of familial acknowledgement, although not free of the homophobia demonstrated by the violent altercation at the beginning of the film, functions nevertheless as a moment of discursive naming and visibility. The normative household and economy in this moment finally admit to the possibility of an alternative sexual identity. The same field of visibility, however, denies the domestic servant the erotic possibility of being gay or lesbian. Instead, the rebuke that the servant receives from the mistress in Bengali reads her same-sex desire as an inadmissible perversion of her affective labors. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself, Devi? She's almost like your child, Devi," says the mother. Although Tara and Devi are close in age, the latter's erotic transgressions are deliberately misinterpreted as incestuous behavior that the reproductive economy of the family cannot tolerate. Thus, the film Devi self-consciously fractures its own lesbian identity between at least two kinds of mediation. On the one hand, it elicits an identification with the utopian cinematic space of cross-class same-sex desire. On the other hand, domestic servitude and class domination become, in the same film, indices for a political economic mediation that includes, but also remain irreducible to, the formal properties of cinema or any mass medium for that matter. Watching Devi at the Kashish Festival in 2017, I also had to acknowledge that the vast majority of domestic servants in India would have neither the resources nor the leisure time to attend such a screening in the middle of a workday. And by the end, the film's assertion of queer desire had morphed for me into a quiet but firm demand for nothing less than a subversion of the political economy that simultaneously harbors homophobia and queer cinematic worlding while keeping intact its neoliberal regime of labor. Film aesthetics was no longer bound to the film text or the cinephilic context within which I was encountering Devi. Instead, the aesthetic had quietly laid bare the festival's own strategic neoliberalism. Aesthetic form had turned into an intermedial dissonance that refused representational capture, rousing me, finally, to the complicity of my own queer spectatorial labor. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ani and Nimanthi. We're going to open this up for questions. Please put them in the chat. We can answer them. I was wondering if Nimanthi or Ani, you had any questions or comments about each other's presentation that you wanted to share.
I don't know. You go ahead, Ani.
Yeah, Nimanthi, thank you. I was going to actually ask you, first of all, I hadn't watched the film, so thank you for sharing that. I want to watch it very soon. But what was standing out to me this time, and I've heard sort of different parts of the book in this discussion today, I was really struck by the way in which you were both raising the need to understand the division between the global South and the global North, but also troubling that division in that moment where Paris starts to resemble a sort of war-torn Sri Lanka. So I'm wondering what the distinction that is often sort of raised in the humanities scholarship, particularly in the context of identity politics and states of exception, et cetera. The terms global North and global South do for you in your book, the relationship between the two.
Yeah, thanks. It's a hard question. I think, thinking about at one level, right? Thinking with Aiwa on can be helpful in the way that you do too, to answer that. And that is to think about neoliberalism as not a uniform system that is applicable in kind of same kind of way, and that it begins in the global North and then spreads to the global South in this kind of singular form. And I think part of why scholars don't recognize kind of the Tamil tigers and their kind of participation in a neoliberal economy is because there's a certain kind of modular way of thinking neoliberalism, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one kind of form and way of understanding that I want to disrupt by calling it neoliberalism in the shadows. And if we think of what Ong says about retooling, like it's a mobile technology, and it will take different parts of a space and restructure it and work with it. And it will encounter certain problems in a space or certain dominant features and adapt to that place, right? So if you think when Tamil militancy and neoliberalism interact, it looks different from the way neoliberalism enters like through the state in the South, right? And similarly, urban, like metropolitan Paris is going to look different from kind of these segregated housing projects. So I think I want to dismantle the global North, global South as uniform, to think of these different technologies used in different places, if that makes sense.
Right? Yeah, it does. And I ask this also because I mean, I'm sort of, it's a question that I sort of think about in my own work as well. And I think one strand that sort of comes out in your work is perhaps the need to distinguish between the experience of the global north or the global south from the standpoint of the state or institutions,
Right.
and individual experiences where those categories can blur depending on the positionality of the actors, in this case, the protagonist. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also in terms of Tamil militancy, these kind
Yeah.
of so-called illegal, illicit, or terrorists, right? As the state would call it, groups. Yeah. No, thank you for that. I mean, I really enjoyed listening to this, and I think I've heard you present a different version, and I think it was different. So I really enjoyed how much our talks spoke to one another. As you were talking about Devi, I kept really, really thinking a lot about Ismat Chughai's The Quilt. That just kept coming to mind so much. And because I teach it and I saw so many resonances there. And I'm wondering if, she's writing it at a time, is it around independence in India, right? If I'm remembering correctly.
40s, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a different historical moment. And its connection to nationalism. And then what you're talking about through Devi is the way the film refuses a kind of homo-nationalism, right? The kind of, we are the great modern nations, right? Like we're joining that. So yeah, I don't know what the question is, but I'm really thinking about Chughai and what she did in the 40s and what Devi is doing maybe in this moment of neoliberalism, I guess.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, you're right. I think there are those really strong connections between the two texts, especially in the kind of representation of the female space and the kind of the domestic space, the site of intimacy. I think what's particular about Devi is the film is a response to queer politics post-liberalization. The fact that in the Devi was made in 2017 in the 21st century, after, let's say, roughly 10, 15 years of activism, the space of activism is so fragmented along the lines of particularly class and gender, that something a festival like Kashish is not unaware of, but has to disavow at some level. So when I look at the festival itself, I mean, that's what's so fascinating, that on the one hand, it has to kind of, for financial reasons, echo this kind of global international rhetoric of LGBTQIA+, where all identities sort of come together across differences, and they're all sort of equal identities, right? That's also a narrative that gay and lesbian are at the same platform as Hijra and Koti. And that narrative is kind of upended by not just Devi, several films that the festival curates. So there's a kind of fascinating sort of autocritical move going on in the way the festival sort of curates films and its programs. So what stands out for me in Devi is that kind of response to that sort of narrative of Indian queer politics sort of joining the global stage, but by overlooking the sites of inequality that have made Indian queer activism possible, and also sort of continuing it in this moment. That's not to say that the queer activism has not made progress. Obviously, for example, the exclusion of, let's say, Hijras from activism in the 1990s, that significantly shifted, and then you see a lot of Hijra and Koti voices in queer activism at the moment. But what's often forgotten is the sort of history of inequality that shaped these identities in the first place, right? And in the context of Devi, it is actively resisting any kind of uncritical celebration of lesbian identity politics, and even the term lesbian as this kind of site of inequality, because not every Indian same-sex desiring woman has access to that term. And what would it mean to then think about a kind of lesbianism under erasure, or queerness under erasure? in the context of the neoliberal post-colony and the reproductive labor that both kind of props it up, but that it also disavows at the same time.
I'm going to barge in and say we have a few questions from the chat, and I want to let some of our audience ask questions. I first want to read off from Mark Baumforth, and then Caitlin Emanuel can ask a question after that. Mark, thanks you both for your interesting talks. And here's a question for Nimanthi. The advertisement described Shobha Shakti as Dalit, and he asks, is that a self-identification? And can you say something about its significance for his work? He said, my understanding was that he was Valalar, Jaffna's dominant caste, which would make the self-identification particularly interesting.
Oh, thank you for that question. It's an easy one to answer. He's not a Velala. He's a Dalit, and he's a writer. And you know, when I was fortunate enough to have a friend who knew of him and his kind of communities, and took me to where Shobha Shakti grew up in the islands, right off of the Jaffna Peninsula. So he's not Velala at all, and that's you know, and the I don't read Tamil, right? But I know from Tamil scholars that Shobha Shakti, the original gorilla in Tamil, uses a very caste-specific Tamil that, you know, is like, you know, the kind of elite Tamils would say, oh, this is very vulgar writing, I think. But he uses that, and he's a Dalit, and that's his identity. Yeah, thank you for that.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It's such an important project, and I really look forward to reading the book. I have a two-part question, one of which kind of extends actually off Mark's question. I'm wondering if you could kind of expand on the framework of, you know, queer Dalit aesthetics in your book. So you began your talk with a very poignant analysis of Shanavanan's work. But of course, he's an artist I respect, he's an artist I work on in my own research, but he's neither queer nor Dalit, and is part of this Valalar community. So I was wondering if you could expand on the role of your, expand on the role of caste in your analysis of shadow neoliberalism and this idea of kind of this resistance aesthetic. And the second question is on the role of Dheepan in your analysis. So you include Dheepan kind of as an extension of Shobha Shakti's writing, as its own, you know, aesthetic experiment that resists racial capitalism. But in fact, the movie wasn't written by Shobha Shakti, it was written by Audiard. And so I'm wondering what the role, the shadow, I guess you could say, of Audiard in thinking about your analysis of racial capitalism and neoliberalism in this film, because of course, Audiard admits to knowing nothing about Sri Lanka before he made this film. It was the quote unquote end of the earth to him. You know, he wanted to make a film about migrants, and French cinema and his own films as well are not absent of these, you know, they have their own reputation for demonizing immigrants through tropes of violence, characterizing these suburbs as violent. So there's a way in which, you know, the reading of the film in which you're talking about how Dheepan or Shobha Shakti, by way of Dheepan, is rejecting the violence of militancy. You know, part of that is also that his humanization and his rejection of militancy comes at the expense of demonizing other immigrant communities, largely Muslim communities in these suburbs. So what is the role of Audiard in your analysis of that? And by extension, by way of the state, because the state's violence is not there in that scene, despite these communities being heavily surveilled, heavily militarized. It's not the state who is violent, but other immigrants. So if you could talk about how that plays into your analysis.
Sure, thank you. That's a whole bunch of questions, and remind me if I missed some of them. In terms of the title, I just want to say the queer and Dalit was a way of trying to give one title to two talks, right? So we were trying to not have two separate titles. So it was as simple as that in terms of the queer. So I apologize if there was a misconception about that. Now, in terms of guerrilla and kind of the aesthetics of difference, resistance and questions of caste, I kind of get into that in the chapter version, right? And I think the guerrilla is far more radical actually than the film, right? I mean, I think it has for more potential. For example, the figure gorilla has like a split, like 3 identities, as I say, right? And when he arrives in Paris, he is this figure who does not want assimilation at all, right? For example, he refuses to work. He refuses to be this kind of good immigrant subject that in Dheepan, like the family want to be, you know, a family of uplift, right? We'll work hard and try to make a go at it. In the novel, the figure of Rocky Raj, you know, refuses that altogether, right? And in the novel ends with them being framed for the murder of this woman. He's being framed and beaten up and tortured by a police officer, right? And then he says, like, you see suddenly like, oh, he's back where he was. And that's where, you know, Sri Lanka and detention in custody in France seem to come together. So I see your point that definitely the novel is far more radical in terms of refusing conformity to capitalism, kind of a neoliberal state that treats you in a certain way. And the film, I think, does not do that. So I take your point. I would say that Audreyard, the potential of the novel is, I think he gave Shobha Shakti and the cast much more leeway in terms of how to manage the script, because the film is entirely in Tamil and he doesn't speak any Tamil, right? So there's a way in which he had to rely heavily on his actors to even understand the script, or he didn't understand what was going on, right? And I think it's kind of what's interesting, right? And I get what you're saying. At a certain level, it looks like, oh, here are the immigrants, just, you know, they're violent and the state is absent, and the family get caught up in the violence of other immigrants who are Arab and Black, right? I see that, but I want to think about the way the film, even if it's to read it against its own grain, is also highlighting like the massive like disarticulation of communities from the centers of power and resources, right? Like people are like, I remember there's a scene when the family catch the train to go to the housing complex, and Yalini says, where are we going? Where is this place? I don't even, like, it looks like it's in the middle of nowhere, right? So there's a way in which the film like helps us understand how much state dispossession is the cause of what's going on, right? And that's why that scene I showed where the part, like the manager shows Shobha Shakti and the family, like, oh, look at those buildings. Look at where you're gonna stay. This is what you're gonna be given, right? So that's my way of mediating that. But I totally agree with you about kind of, it could totally be read as like, oh, aren't these immigrants all just violent? So I take that point. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
We have one more question for Ani Maitra. This question comes from Saronik Basu, who asks, I'm wondering what your thoughts are regarding how Devi can be situated re larger trajectories of class difference and representations in Indian cinema about queer people, queer desire across class borders, but also characterized by class insularity. Fire obviously comes to mind, where the lovers inhabit the exact same class space.
Thank you, Sharonik, for that question. It's an important one, primarily because there haven't been too many films made about queerness in Indian cinema, mainstream Indian cinema. Fire is an important film historically because it was in some ways contributed to queer activism. The organization called Calorie was formed as a response to Fire. It also led to right-wing fundamentalist sort of attacks. So it's a very historically important film. But one of the things to remember that the right-wing critique was that, you know, the film was made by diasporic filmmakers. It wasn't Indian enough, but that, of course, had the opposite effect of really sort of mobilizing queer activism on the ground. I think it's important to situate Devi in the context of other films that are being made in India, and not by mainstream filmmakers necessarily, but rather independent and emergent filmmakers. So in the book, for example, I look at student films, this film called Astetva by Kiran Pawar, this film by another an Indian activist called, activist filmmaker called Debolina Mojumdar, Ebong Bewarish, and Sharon Flynn, another filmmaker, her film, their film Identity. These are films that explicitly take on the kind of tension between queer identity politics that does not consider class and the very classed experiences of queerness, either through sort of the fragmentations within mainstream urban activism, or exploring the tension between, let's say, the Hijra experience and the sort of the homo-national representation, or the homo-global, as I call it, representations that sort of Kashish kind of thrives on. So these are some films that are definitely in the back of my mind when I talk about Devi, and I discuss in the book as well. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you for both for great presentations. Annie, I had a question regarding the title, the word Devi, because I mean, it's such a kind of a overcharged
Yes.
a signifier, right? In the sense that, and it can mean, I mean, it can signify kind of divinity and so on, right? The goddess, but also it marks a certain kind of like in art, from speaking from an art history point of view. I mean, there was, for example, an exhibition called Devi, the Great Goddess, which looked at kind of forms of. But then there were also these artists that were brought up by the folk museum, which were basically quote unquote tribal artists, or artists who who were women who practiced indigenous forms of decorative arts, which were then brought into the art gallery, and many of them had names like Ganga Devi, or so it seems to me that it does both at the same time. It both kind of signifies or refers to this kind of ideas of Shakti and female power and so on, but then it's at the same time also signifying a kind of a subaltern kind of a life. So is this something you see? I mean, I'm just speculating, but I don't know if you had thoughts about the title.
No, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I think there is that, definitely, that ambiguity or paradox, or however you want to call it, that when the film begins, you see a certain assertiveness in Devi's character, the way she sort of conducts herself, the lack of hesitation in kind of engaging in this kind of relationship with her employer's daughter. And there's a kind of strength in the character, built into the character, that you see right from the get-go. And at the same time, her subaltern position isn't something that she can negotiate to kind of convert into something else, right? That's where the kind of informal economy within which that shapes her identity as a domestic servant, I guess, dominates more than any other kind of mythical understanding of female strength and power. In that living room scene, there's also that, I don't know if you noticed, Iftikhar, there's a painting in the back wall by, I'm blanking on the name of the artist. I believe it's Jaya Wheaton, Jaya Rastogi Wheaton, and she has this kind of series of Rajasthani women, and that is one of those sort of images of Rajasthani women, and it's kind of fascinating moment of contradiction of the subaltern aestheticized on the wall. Then you have the employers, chit-chatting and ordering, making plans for the party, and then you have kind of Devi in the foreground disappearing in her labor. So there's kind of the kind of very sort of carefully organized layers of labor and representation in that moment in the film. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, okay. Is the film available? to watch?
It is, I'm not sure if it's available online, but if you reach out to the filmmaker, you can actually buy a copy for Cornell, which is what I did for Colgate. And the filmmaker Karishma Dubey, her new film Bitju has just got an Oscar nomination, which I'm thrilled about. I just heard this morning. I was reaching out to her to ask her, who's that painting by? Because I wanted to kind of think through it. but you can reach out to her and buy the film for the Cornell Library.
Yeah, we need to do that. Yeah. Well, thank you both for very stimulating talks. And thanks to the audience for attending, and please join us for our future talks.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
So much. Thank you for having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.